Yeah, and the weird.
Good morning, everybody. Hopefully you can see my screen. So, my name is Mark Edgeworth. Thank you for attending our webinar this morning. I'm the Vice President of Lean Six Sigma Consulting Services at William George Associates, and this is going to be a high-level overview of Lean Six Sigma. What it is, why are people using it, what are they hoping to get out of it, and giving you a few results that we've seen out of the market. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started. So Lean Six Sigma, why is it out there? Well, up until probably about the late 90s, they were really kind of two separate methodologies that dealt with different types of business issues, whether it was in terms of efficiency or effectiveness. And so what they found is that it made sense to combine the two methodologies together because, as your slide points out, typically companies have combinations of both types of issues. And so when we talk about efficiency and effectiveness, this is essentially where Lean and Six Sigma come into play. So effectiveness is essentially how effective are we at meeting our customers' needs. If you go back to what Peter Drucker said a long time ago, the father of modern management, he said the sole purpose of a business is to create a customer. Well, if that happens to be the case, then we really need to understand what they need. If we don't understand what our customers need, then how effective are we essentially in doing what we do as an organization, whether it's providing a service or providing a product. So that's essentially the focus of Six Sigma. With Lean, it's all about efficiency. And if I want to tie it into that effectiveness piece is, how can I be effective at the least possible cost, right? And there's a lot of luminaries within Lean and within Six Sigma, and Joseph Juran is one of them. And essentially, he's in talking about the business process management piece of it. These are two of the criteria or the observations that he came up with. Now, it can be effective and not efficient, and we can be efficient and not effective, right? But the whole goal, of course, is how can I be both at the same time? Because if we're not, let's say, for example, we're efficient but we're not effective, the joke that I usually like to say or use when I talk about that particular aspect of it is, our product really isn't that good, but I can get it to you really quickly. Whereas on the other side, if we have a very good product, but we're not very efficient in getting it out to the marketplace, then we can say, well, I've got a really great product, but by the time I get it out to the market, somebody else has already come up with something better, and you lose market share and all that. So typically, right, companies have both types of issues. And so essentially what we try to do with Lean Six Sigma is give you a set of tools, right? Call it process improvement. Lean and Six Sigma, or Lean Six Sigma, as I'll just talk about going forward, is just a broad set of tools wrapped, or with a methodology wrapped around it. Because the tools in and of themselves are really nothing different than process improvement tools that have been around forever. Whether you talk about total quality management, quality circles, any of those methodologies that have come before Lean Six Sigma, the tools are essentially the same. So the only thing that's really changed is the methodology around it. And so when I talk about that, right, let's talk about the Lean part first. Lean is a term that when I say we, it's essentially the researchers at MIT. They're the ones that really coined that Lean term back in the late 80s. So essentially what they were doing is they were looking at the Toyota production system in Japan and saying, okay, what are the things that they're doing that make them so efficient in the way they do things? And one of the researchers at MIT wrote a paper about this, and that whole group eventually led with Jim Womack and Dan Jones, who were two of the people there, eventually led to a book that came out called The Machine That Changed the World, that were written by those two people, which then spawned another book, which everybody is probably more familiar with if you're familiar with Lean at all, which is Lean Thinking. And then a third in the series of books that came out was Lean Solutions. And so that term lean is something we coined to essentially say this is our iteration, if you will, of the Toyota production system. And it essentially, what drives lean, and we could spend days talking about it, is lean is a philosophy. And in that philosophy, we look at what do we do that creates value for the customer, and we focus solely on that. Right? So anything that does not create value for the customer, we consider to be waste. Now, it's waste that we can get rid of, but there's also waste that still has to remain in the process. Right? There's no such thing as being 100% value added, so there's always going to be some amount of waste in there. But in identifying this, it really becomes a customer-focused type of environment, right, where you're looking at all the things of value. Does it add value? Doesn't it add value? And all of those things that don't add value, can I get rid of it or not? So another way of looking at it, and the way that you might typically hear it referred to a lot of times, is lean is the continuous elimination of waste driven by customer satisfaction. And so one of the things about the cultural aspect of lean, if you will, is that everything is driven by the customer. Right? If the customer is not happy, then essentially we're doing something wrong. And while that might sound kind of common sense, in reality, a lot of times organizations don't look at it that way. It's more along the lines of, okay, how much revenue have we generated this quarter over quarter for the fiscal year? What are we trying to do next quarter or next year, rather than having all that essentially being driven by customer satisfaction. So from a philosophical perspective, it's a little bit different as well. Now, it also creates a culture around value, and I've seen the term used before in other industries of people, process, and product. Just throwing another P in there as well as profit. And so people, process, and products, right, those things that we have internal to our organizations, they should provide value. They should provide value to the organization, which then should, as long as we understand what our customers want, create profit. And so if you take a look at the business card for any of the companies over in Japan, like Panasonic, or if you've ever gone to Toyota City and taken a tour of their facility there, a lot of that is really focused around people. Right? If people are the ones that are on the front lines, they are the ones that actually work the process, then shouldn't they also be included in the decision making of how well the process works, or what we should be doing with the process, rather than just simply saying, okay, this is what I believe we should do, now go do it. In Lean, the thinking is more along the line of, this is what I think we should do, what do you think? Right? So philosophically, it's a little bit of a different part of it as well. And so when I talk about the Lean and I talk about the Six Sigma, it is as much about the philosophy and the culture of the organization that it is simply about the tools. The tools provide you benefit, right? But the culture and the philosophy of the organization is what sustains that effort within that company. So Lean, in many cases, is very much common sense. If you've ever gone around the house and, say, did spring cleaning, essentially you were doing something with Lean. If you have ever watched a golf tournament on TV and you look at everything that they do in terms of organizing and playing a golf tournament, then you essentially understand a lot of the Lean principles that come into play. So when I say Lean is common sense, essentially that's what I'm saying. If you've ever walked around the house and you know you had something and you couldn't find it, and so you launched off on a half-hour or 45-minute Easter egg hunt in your house looking for something, essentially what you did is you violated one part of Lean thinking, right? Everything should be in an orderly place so that you know exactly where things are, because if you're searching for something for 45 minutes, essentially you're not creating value for 45 minutes. And once again, that is the focus of Lean. So like I said, a lot of Lean is common sense. We practice some aspects of Lean pretty much on a daily basis, but we also at the same time violate certain aspects of Lean as well. We probably don't even know that we're doing it. because, once again, it's pretty much common sense. So there are essentially 5 guiding principles behind Lean. And these were in the picture that you have in the lower right-hand corner. That on the left is Jim Womack, and the one on the right is Dan Jones. Those are the 2 people that wrote Machine to Change the World, Lean Thinking, and Lean Solutions. And so in that, they developed these 5 guiding principles of Lean. And as you see on the slide, they're pretty basic. Right? 1, identify value by product or process. Identify customer value. So we need to understand what provides value to the customer. Right? And the only way to do that, of course, is to go off and ask them, what is it you want from us? Understanding what they want, then we go in and we take a look at everything that we do as an organization that provides value to the customer. And we essentially create maps. We call them value stream maps. And here, we look at all the activities for every process, for every product we do, that we have, that creates value, not only for the customer, but for the organization. What does it look like? The value stream map is really important because it's a lot of times it's described as the principal Lean diagnostic tool, because it will show you your entire process, what works well, what isn't working so well, and it'll allow you to go off and fix it. And all the things that we do, right, what we're trying to do is we're trying to make value flow smoothly throughout my process. So a lot of times when you look at things, or you look at how we do things internally, there are a lot of stops and starts. Right? We stop, we start, or in the manufacturing environment, we'll make something and then it'll sit in inventory for a long time until somebody's ready for it. But we don't really want to do that with Lean. So think of it kind of like as synchronized swimming, where you have a lot of people essentially going through the same motions. That's essentially what you want to try to do with Lean, because if you do it that way, you're very much more efficient. So if I had like 3 people lined up and it was a 3-step process to make something, if everybody was moving at the same pace, as soon as I was finished with one thing and I handed off to the next person, they would have just finished what they're doing and handing it off to the person downstream from them. Right? So making it flow smoothly. Every time something doesn't flow smoothly, there's typically something wrong with the process. That's what you want to go off and investigate. Another aspect of Lean, and the 4th guiding principle, is letting the customer pull value from the process. And I like to use the traditional story about what this really means. If you ever go to the grocery store at, say, 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, typically the only other people that are going to be in there, besides a smattering of customers, are going to be vendors. And what are they doing? They're essentially restocking shelves. And so, you know, let's say I'm a bread vendor and we're supposed to have 10 loaves of bread on the shelf, and I go in and I see that there's 6. That means the customer pulled 4 loaves of bread off the shelf. So I'm going to go out to my truck, I'm going to get 4 loaves of bread, and I'm going to restock that. And then tomorrow if I come back and 4 loaves are left, then I'd go off and restock it with 6. And so if I go through that entire process, so I take 6 loaves of bread out of my truck. When I go back to the bakery, they need to put 6 loaves of bread back into the truck, which means they have to bake 6 loaves of bread. In order to do that, they have to pull flour and all the ingredients off the shelf to make the bread. When they do that, they have to replace that on the shelf, so they go back to the supplier and say, I need more flour, and so on and so forth. That entire process is essentially pull. And it all starts with the customer pulling product off the shelf. Now, the old story goes that Taiichi Ohno, who was the chief architect of the Toyota production system, came over to the United States to see if he could learn anything from Ford in terms of how we made cars here. And in that visit, the story goes that he went to the supermarket and saw this entire process in motion, and really what led to that 4th guiding principle of Lean. But then the last one, of course, is pursuing perfection. And as I pointed out in parentheses, it's a mindset. And essentially what I'm saying with that is that if we go through and we continuously improve our process, we make it more efficient, we make it more effective, at some point in time, as the thought process goes, it seems that perfection is possible. And so what I'm essentially saying here is if you do not believe it is possible to do perfect work, doesn't it bias the way you approach work? So for example, let's say I manage a Ford dealership. I would expect the people that work for me to drive a Ford. But if I don't drive a Ford, doesn't that affect the way I approach people if they say, well, I don't want to drive a Ford? So it's the same type of thought process. You have to approach it in terms of knowing or accepting or having the mindset that at least it's possible to achieve perfection. You're probably never going to get there, but the goal should always be to strive for perfection and then improve the process as much as you can as long as it's feasible to do so. Okay? So those are essentially the guiding principles behind Lean. Now, why? Why do organizations do this? Now, there's been a lot of studies that are out there. And here you have essentially two sources that essentially reflect the same thing. So organizations typically look at implementing Lean within the organization because there's pressure, right? We are not making as much money. Or in this particular economic downturn right now, we're doing everything that we can, and we're still not able to do as much as we need to keep our organization viable. So we have pressure to improve our performance. Customers, right? They demand lower prices. We have other companies that are essentially trying to do the same thing, and so in order for us to maintain a competitive advantage or to keep up with everybody else, we need to look at essentially doing the same thing. Profit is always a pressure point, especially in an economic downturn. We will need to keep our profit up to keep our organization viable. So there's always a pressure to do that. And then customer demanding shorter cycle times, or essentially lead times. If I order something, how long does it take for you to get it to me? They want it quicker. And so essentially, in going off and conducting these studies, both Malcolm Wheatley at the Manufacturing Business Technology and also the Lean Alliance over in Europe, essentially the same thing. So if you look at the top 5 reasons why people or why organizations are trying to incorporate Lean principles or Lean concepts within the organization, this is essentially the top 3. And it gives you a percentage of all those who were queried. How many said this? How many said this was the reason? So you have those top 5. Now, in doing this then, what do we get out of it? What do we get out of implementing Lean within our organization? So this one was done probably about 3 years ago, and it was a study of Lean implementation over in Malaysia. Now, the National Institute of Standards and Technology here in the United States essentially did the same type of a 10-year study with about 270 companies within the U.S., and they're all pretty close, depending on who you talk to and which PowerPoint you look at. But in this particular case, this graph represents 44 companies that responded to the study in terms of, okay, what benefits did you get out of the implementation of Lean? As you can see from here, the big one that everybody got was reduced cost, which is essentially efficiency, right? Doing or being efficient at the least possible cost. And so 88.64% of those companies that responded said, yes, we saw reduced cost, we saw improved productivity, we didn't have to throw away things as much because we saw reduced waste, we didn't have to carry as much inventory, we increased our profit, we improved quality, we improved response time, which is essentially lead time. So half of the companies saw that, and then improved flexibility. Like I said, it's pretty much the same thing with the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They saw what a 75% increase or decrease, if you will, in floor space. Probably about a 50% increase in productivity, 90% increase in quality, 95 to 98% reduction in lead time, or some of the figures that I saw from this study that was done. And so organizations are doing this type of work essentially, as we talked about up front, to become more efficient more than anything else. And so at a very high level, that's really what Lean is all about. Okay? Now, in terms of Six Sigma, I'd like to use the old story about the three blind men and the elephant, except we'll throw a couple more people in here. And essentially what I mean by this is that Six Sigma, and to some extent Lean as well, is different based on where you touch it. And so with Six Sigma, in one thing, or in one aspect, it is a philosophy that to succeed as a company, we need to fully understand our customers. And so that's another piece that very much ties into what we just talked about with Lean. It is a customer-driven environment. So one aspect of it is that. Another aspect of it is a shift in organizational focus that recognizes and leverages all the sources of value within the organization. And that, once again, is a cultural difference. And that is very much in keeping with what we just talked about with Lean as well. What are all the sources of value? How do I leverage those sources of value to create value for the organization in this particular case? Right? What does your management team really think about? Right? What's really the measure of success? Right? That is typically profit. But it is profit driven by customer satisfaction or customer value. And another aspect of it is the methodology. How do I deliver a nearly defect-free product or process on a consistent basis? This is where we start thinking about those statistical tools. And this is what really a lot of times scares people away from Six Sigma. Very much ready to adopt Lean because, like I said, it's common sense, but not so ready to adopt this because they think you have to be a statistician to do this. And no, you don't really have to be, but essentially what you do is you use these statistical tools to essentially prove what you believe to be true. How does my process really work? Does this happen to be the case? Is this really what the customer wants? So we use the tools to do this. But the goal, very much like with Lean, is how do I develop a nearly defect-free product or process on a consistent basis? So there's another touch point, if you will, of Six Sigma. And then, from a management perspective, it's a strategy, right? How do I take project management, because essentially most process improvement work is done through projects. How do I take that and statistical measures to produce results that drive quality and profit? Right? Because quality is important, but once again, profit is also important to the organization as well because that's what we try to do. Right? That is the whole goal of doing what we do. Now, having said that, with Lean, it's all about eliminating waste. With Six Sigma, one of the primary focuses is process variation. How does my process change? And so we focus on this because when the customers look at our processes, they're not really affected by the average. So for example, if you have an organization that sells products to customers, and if something goes wrong with the product, they ship it back to you to get it fixed. So internally, if I have like a repair depot, I always focus on like turnaround time. Right? What is the average turnaround time from when a customer sends something to me till I send it back? And we measure ourselves on that. The quicker I turn things around, the better we are. But there's always variation. So if I took a look at 10 products that went into the repair depot, how long did it take to turn those around? And they're all going to be different. And so let's say the average turnaround time is 6 days, but the variation is anywhere from 3 days to 18 days. Well, we focus on the average, but the customer feels the variation. They're going to get their product back anywhere from 3 to 18 days. Right? And so that's why when we implemented Six Sigma GE, one of the things that Jack Welch said was variation is evil. And essentially that's why he said it, because the customer focus is not on the average. The customer focus is on how much variation that they're going to get. So essentially in looking at all your processes, we know that everything that we do has variation. The question is, right, how consistent are our processes? So it's the same thing as like driving to work every morning. There's probably different routes you can take to get to work. Is one more consistent than the other one? Because sometimes, depending on the traffic, you might get to work on time. Sometimes you might not. Well, if the goal is to consistently get to work on time, which is the best way to go? Same type of thought process. Now, when we take a look at these types of issues, the question is, well, how do we measure ourselves? How do we know that we're doing whatever our customers want us to do on a consistent basis? And typically, or historically, or traditionally, if you will, we've always measured quality as a percentage. And so I put on the slide 99% server availability, 99% turbine availability. I remember at one point in time that if I guaranteed my customer 99% availability, they were thrilled. He said, wow, that's really great. So there's only 1% of the time where my servers or my gas turbine or whatever won't be working. And then, as time went by and people started to understand what that 1% really meant, that was no longer satisfactory. 1% could be huge. So let's say, for example, I'm Amazon.com. If I'm down 1%, that's what? How many hours? How many hours in a year? Right. If I take that and I multiply it by how much revenue Amazon generates in an hour, then you start talking about big numbers. And so on the last point where I say we work at the process level but we feel at the business level, that's essentially what I'm saying. So for example, I worked with a value-added reseller, like something like a CDW, but on a smaller scale. Let's say you looked at the account managers and looked at their outbound selling. And let's say you looked at their process. What are all the things that happen? And then you notice that, you know, over the course of any type of transaction, there was a certain amount of delay when they were waiting for their order entry software to get to the next screen, or if they were looking at their inventory control software to see if they had, you know, the pieces in stock that the customer wanted. There was a delay there. Let's say, you know, there was maybe like a 5-second delay. At the process level, you probably wouldn't even think anything of it. But how does that process, how does that 5 seconds per transaction multiplied by the number of transactions or the number of sales an account manager does in the course of a 24-hour period, multiplied by the number of account managers you have, multiplied by the number of days that you are working and selling, essentially what we found out was that every second of delay in the application resulted in a $1.7 million potential sales loss. And so with 5 seconds, you're talking about, what, 8.5, almost $9 million. So because of this, that organization did a complete technology refresh. Everybody in the organization got brand new computers. They went in and took a look at their applications. They took a look at their servers. They took a look at the network and found out, how do I get rid of the 5 seconds? Or how do I cut it down? Because essentially, for every second I can cut out of that, I'm essentially getting another $1.7 million in revenue, or the opportunity to generate another $1.7 million in revenue. So when I say that work is at the process level, but we feel it at the business level, that's what the focus always has to be. Because at the process level, once again, it might seem inconsequential, but at the business level, it's not. Okay? So, here's a little exercise. Right now, if you look at what most of the literature out there says, a world-class organization is one that gets it, whatever that is, gets it right 99.38% of the time. And so if I was going to go on a business trip, I would want to fly on a world-class airline. Don't want to fly on a small one because, well, they're inherently not as safe, right? So let's say I book a flight on a world-class airline, and they're 99.38. And for the purpose of this exercise, let's say if there's a 99.38% chance that I will get to my destination, which of course you know what that 0.62 means, that you do not arrive safely at your destination. The question is, would you fly on the plane? And so once again, we're kind of looking at the process level. And this was the kind of the downside of measuring it based on a percentage. So let's take a look at it this way. If I go back to 2008, the last time I have a really good number, right? The FAA said that there was approximately 13.5 million commercial flights in the United States in that year. If I apply that 0.62% to that, essentially what that means is 230 flights a day. So if we apply this not arriving safely, let's say for discussion purposes that meant crashes. That means on any given day you would have 230 airplanes crashing, or essentially just under 10 an hour, or about 1 every 6 minutes. If you saw this on TV all the time, right, your local news is now 3 hours long. They come up with a 24-hour airline channel on TV, on cable, just to cover all this. You might probably change your mind that you're not willing to fly on a plane that's 99.38%. That's not good enough anymore if you're looking at figures like this. So once again, looking or feeling it at the business level, I'm probably not going to fly on a plane. And so why I say that this is kind of philosophically how we look at things is that if you are not willing to fly on a world-class airline that's 99.38% good, why are you willing to run your business that way? Because if a world-class business is 99.38 and we just decided based on the figures that we're not going to fly on the plane, if you're not willing to fly on that world-class airline, why are you willing to accept that as being the definition of a world-class company? And so those organizations that do this or decide that they want to adopt or implement Lean Six Sigma, this is essentially why. And when you really get to the business level, the numbers can be staggering in terms of what it really means to an organization. I mean, you look at McDonald's. If you look at McDonald's now, they don't do things the way they used to. Back in the old days, you could walk into McDonald's and you had the glass window on the side, and you could see people cooking burgers on the grill. Well, now if you go into McDonald's, you see that they've almost kind of gone to like the Taco Bell type of Burger King concept, where when you order a burger, they actually pull it out of a bin and it's already been cooked, right? And so it's almost like just in time. So you're making a burger or you're getting the burger just in time, and it reduces the amount of waste, right? How many burgers at the end of the day, or if a burger's been sitting on the shelf for X amount of time, how many burgers do you throw away? And let's say you're just making, cheeseburgers off the dollar menu. So it's $1 for every cheeseburger you throw away. So if I throw 2 cheeseburgers away in my store during any given day, I might think that that's probably pretty good. But at a corporate level, when I look at the fact that I've got 30,000 McDonald's worldwide, once again, those numbers get really, 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 really big. And that's just assuming that I only throw away 2. And typically, in the old days, you were throwing away a lot more. I know because in my high school days, I worked at McDonald's, and I knew how much we threw away there. I could just imagine what it would be like corporate-wide, right? So that's part of it. Now, what does this mean? What does this all mean to us in terms of the Six Sigma piece of it? One of the things that we did at GE, and I borrowed this slide from our Greenbelt training, is if I look at the classic view of quality, we're 99% good. And I look at the Six Sigma view of quality, which is way higher than the 99.38, right? If I'm operating at a Six Sigma level of quality, essentially what I'm saying is I get a rate 99.99966% of the time. And if we go by that and we compare that view of where we want to be in terms of a quality perspective, and we compare it to our classical view or definition of quality, you can see what the differences are. Let me look at the last one. If I'm 99% good, my utility company, I'm going to have no electricity for almost 7 hours each month. And I hope it's not all at the same time, because if it is, I'm restocking my refrigerator once a month. Whereas if they are operating at a Six Sigma level of quality, I lose 1 hour of power every 34 years. And it's with the rest of them. The incorrect surgical operations, I know that was a really big thing here, because if you look at the hospitals in Boston now, their whole procedure, their whole process of going through surgical procedures is completely different than it used to be because they made mistakes. I think one person went in for gallstone surgery or gallbladder surgery, and they woke up with a leg missing. And this was a true story. And so everything has changed within the hospital because of that. And so even one incorrect surgical operation per week can be unacceptable, but at 99%, right, we're doing 5,000 a week. And so a lot of times when you talk about, what is the motivation for doing this, it's looking at, in the past, what was our classical view of we're doing a good job as compared to what we really want to strive for, that near defect-free work that we talk about. So that's the view. So you could say, well, that's all fine and good, Mark, but what is it really going to get me? Right? Why should I do this? Right? Is there anything out there that says that this is a good thing to do? So let's take a look at that. There was a study done by iSix Sigma Magazine and the Innovation 360 Institute to say, okay, over the last 20 years, what kind of an impact has this had out in the marketplace? And they focused on the Fortune 500. And so they're saying that 53% of Fortune 500 companies have either implemented Lean Six Sigma or Six Sigma or in the process of doing so. And looking back over the last 20 years, they estimated that these Fortune 500 companies have saved $427 billion in the last 20 years. That's $500 billion worth of benefit. When I was at GE, in the first 5 years of implementing Six Sigma, from 96 essentially to when Jack said we're going to do this, to 2001, in total, we realized $12 billion in benefit. And it grew quite a lot incrementally year over year over year until when we got to 2001, there was $5 billion in gain alone. It was $3.5 billion in internal productivity gains, and there was another $1.5 billion of customer impact. Because once again, if we are providing high quality products, or if we're not providing our customers defective work, what does that mean to them? There's obviously a cost associated with them having to work with defective or products that have defects. Well, if I can eliminate those defects that I'm providing to my customer, what kind of financial impact does it have on them? And in 2001 for us, it was $1.5 billion just on customer impact. And so the old adage goes, right, Six Sigma really started with Motorola back in the 80s. And, they still have the copyright on the name, but they let everybody use it. And so Motorola had some really good gains off of that as well, and other companies started to adopt it, including Allied Signal, which is now actually part of Honeywell. Honeywell is still trying to figure out how to embrace Six Sigma from the way that Allied Signal did it to their organization. But Jack knew the CEO of Allied Signal, and he went off to see, okay, what are you doing with this? And essentially what he walked away with, wow, this is really good. You're using these tools and this methodology to improve the effectiveness of your manufacturing operation. Why can't we use this for everything? Why does it just have to be about manufacturing? Can't I use it for sales? Can I use it for marketing? Can I use it for operations? Can I use it for everything? And so what he came back to GE with is, we're going to implement this, and this is going to be part of our DNA, is the way he put it. This is central to everything that we do every single day for everything. And so essentially what happened is, we took it out of the manufacturing world, and it's essentially the same thing with Lean. We brought it into the rest of the world. And once organizations started to see that you could affect process improvement, not just within manufacturing, but the entire realm of business process management, then that's really when it started catching on. I think the little adage that I always heard before was that Motorola invented Six Sigma, GE perfected it. Essentially, that's what they were saying. Right? So here are the results of this and why companies really started adopting it. Now, another aspect of that as well that really drove this is, there's been a lot of studies that say, what is the cost of poor quality of the organizations? What if I don't get it right 99.99966% of the time? What is the impact? And essentially the figures go that if I am a run-of-the-mill organization, not world-class, so if a world-class is 99.38, that means other organizations that aren't world-class are obviously less than that. So what is the financial impact to them for this, the poor quality that they have? And the estimate is anywhere from 25 to 40%, or some people even say 50% of gross revenue. Not net revenue, but gross. So if your organization is $100 million a year, and you are an average company, you could be spending $25 million out of that $100 million dealing with quality issues. And you might ask the question, well, how's that possible? Well, let's look at it this way. If you do not have confidence in the quality of the product you make or the process or service you provide to your customer, how do you make sure that you're not shipping a defective product to your customer, or you're selling a defective service to them? Well, you do audits, you do continuous training. If you make something, you do 100% inspection. So in other words, you inspect everything that goes out the door. Well, there's a cost to all of this. And if you tally up all the tangible and intangible costs of having to deal with poor quality, that's essentially where that 25 to 50% comes from. So how does that compare to an organization that is effective process improvement, or in this particular case, the Six Sigma? What does that mean? The figures I've seen are probably somewhere around 5%. Right? There's always going to be waste. There's always going to be quality issues. But typically speaking, it's 5 to 7% of their gross revenue, as opposed to 25 to 50. So the question is, right, if you're good and you're spending 25 out of your $100 million, what are you willing to spend to get the 25 million back, or get the 20 million back? And so essentially, this is what really started driving this, and this is why you see all these companies adopting this, because the thought process is clear. I want to have that money back. I want to deliver quality products to my customer, but you have to understand who they are first. What is their perception of value? What is it they're looking for? And that is really a fundamental difference. And I almost hate to say that, but if you look at a lot of companies out there, that can be a fundamental difference in the way they look at how they measure success. Do I measure success based on how much money I make? Do I measure my success based on how satisfied my customers are? If I make a decision about doing something, could I prove it? Right? Part of this is also about data-driven decision-making, which kind of gets back to that statistical analysis piece of it again. If you're going to spend $2 million on a marketing campaign, shouldn't you understand why you're doing it and be able to prove it? And so that was the one of the few things that really surprised me about when I went to GE. is that for every decision you made, for every opinion you had in a meeting, if you gave your opinion or you said, we're going to do this, the next question out of the mouth was always, prove it. But the thought process being, if you can't prove why you're doing something, then why are you doing it? And once again, that is a fundamental difference in the way companies behave. And so it's always doing something like this is always a good thing once people understand what it is and they kind of get over the fear of, like, what is this with the statistics, right? What are the other statistics? Typically, an organization that implements Six Sigma in the first year realizes a tenfold increase in quality, because essentially what you're dealing with is all the low-hanging fruit, right? All those problems that you know your organization has, but nobody's ever figured out how to fix it. If you can pick up all the low-hanging fruit, or the fruit that's already fallen off the tree and is sitting on the ground, right? All these things that have a wide impact on the organization, the things that are relatively easy to fix, that's essentially where that tenfold increase in quality comes from. But it also points to another aspect of Six Sigma, which is why a lot of companies that do this kind of have a problem sustaining it. How can you have a tenfold increase in quality within your organization without fundamentally changing how your business works? And that's just the first year. There are magnitudes of change after that as well. And so the Wall Street Journal back in 2010 did an article, and that they said that 60% of the organizations that attempted to implement Six Sigma failed to do so. Not because they didn't understand the tools, but because that culture, that mindset, that philosophy wasn't there. And so anytime you run into problems, what happens? Just go back to your comfort zone. And essentially that's what the article was talking about, that without that organizational commitment to doing this and understanding that you have to change if you're going to realize that much of a change in the way you do business, that's one of the big pieces of it as well, which is why I a lot of times focus more on the fundamental pieces of what does this, the Lean or the Six Sigma methodology mean, more than anything else. Okay? So, anyway, once again, a very high-level view of what Lean is, what Six Sigma is, why companies use it, what kind of results do they typically get. So, I'd like to go ahead and open up the floor if anybody has any questions.
I'm not seeing any questions in the queue at this time, Mark.
Okay. All right. Once again, if nobody has any questions, I thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I hope it gave you, if your intent was to get a little bit more information about what Lean is all about, what Six Sigma is all about, and essentially how they play together, I hope we're able to answer the questions for you. Once again, just a final opportunity to ask questions if you want. Otherwise, have a great day, and thank you very much for attending.